Hello and welcome to Members' Voices, a podcast series from iNote. Here, we give voice to the passion and the insight of English teachers working in Irish classrooms today. If you have an insight or a perspective to share with your fellow teachers, we'd love to feature it on the podcast. Just send your contribution attached to an email as an audio file. Submissions would ideally be between 5 and 15 minutes in length, and you're free to cover any aspect of English teaching at post-primary level in Ireland. To submit or even to run an idea past us, get in touch via the website, through social media, or by email at inoteaudiovisual@gmail.com. In this, the first of our Members' Voices series, we hear from Jerome Devitt on the topic of Ivan Boland's poem, The War Horse.
I know that I began writing in a country, said Ivan Boland in the introduction to her 1995 book Object Lessons, where the word woman and the word poet were almost magnetically opposed. One word was used to invoke collective nurture, the other to sketch out self-reflective individualism. Both states were necessary, that much the culture conceded, but they were oil and water and could not be mixed. Boland found herself, therefore, for much of her poetic career, quote, shouting across the distance between two seemingly polar opposites. Well, the proof of the pudding, as they say, is in the eating. One of the ways in which I've begun to think more productively with students about the poetry of Ivan Boland is to test what she has said she was trying to do against what she actually does in her poems. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that a poet can only be understood through the lens of a dogged adherence to a certain manifesto, but in introducing students to Boland, I've invariably found that linking the poet's goals to what the poet actually does with their writing is both accessible and helps students to think about the poems as poems, where the language matters, where the way in which the poet communicates their ideas can have sometimes an even stronger impact on the reader than the words themselves. One of the early ways I try to do this is not by a mechanical process of identifying poetic devices and finding examples of their usage within the various poems, though that approach can certainly yield benefits down the line. I like to start with language, more specifically the meticulous way in which Boland chooses her words, because the words themselves often do so much to bridge the gaps between the polarized themes she explores. The worlds that she deals with are juxtaposed, maybe even transposed, in the same way as her words, often playfully, sometimes intriguingly, invariably electrically, serve that same master. I love, as I always tell my own students, when the what and the how of a poem rhyme. I want to walk you through just one example of where a teacher and student might start that examination of word choice, with The War Horse. One of the useful things about the exercise that I'm about to suggest to you is that it takes little prior knowledge of poetic form, rhyme, rhythm, metre, or linguistic device. It does require a little bit of historical context, but given the high-stakes nature of the troubles in Northern Ireland, one invariably finds that students can get a sense of what's at stake with just the barest of memory jogging. Many commentaries on the poem rightly note that in this poem, the relatively cloistered domestic world of suburban Dublin is impinged upon by the looming contemporary violence of Northern Ireland, so ably symbolised by the image of the horse trampling in the garden, albeit with limited impact, wherein Boland and her neighbours take refuge behind, quote, a subterfuge of curtains. But where is the shouting across the distance that Boland so fervently espoused in Object Lessons? It's in the language. Once the students acknowledge that the action of the poem, so to speak, is all but completed by the end of line 9 in this 30-line poem, and get on board with the idea that the remaining 2/3 of the poem is predominantly a reflection upon those events, we can begin to dig deeper into Boland's choice of words. A simple task now lies ahead. Find the green words. They're the safe, domestic, suburban, quotidian words, and ask the students to circle them or underline them in their text. What might they find? The window on line 5, the unthreatening Enniskerry Road on line 7, the rose on line 12, the stone house on line 13, the curtains and short street of line 23, the hedge of line 28. Good, we're making progress. There are no hard words here. The language is pretty accessible. Sometimes the town mice in the class might need to look up a botany word or have it explained to them, as I had to, given that I had particularly ungreen fingers and had to look them up in my own day. But thus far, none of the speed bumps that now pepper the suburban landscape outside the M50 ring of Dublin have impeded the students' understanding. Now, the more dramatic part. Let's look for the red words. The violent words, the words that evoke death, destruction, war, fear, and conflict. At first, the pickings are slim, the battlements are lightly manned. In the first dozen or so lines, they might find death, torn and maimed, before the pace really picks up and the frequency of the red words takes hold. Lines 13, 14 and 16 give us expendable, defence, volunteer, the terrifying, quote, screamless dead, tolerable only because it's used to describe the otherwise innocuous rose. But the search for the red word continues apace. Line 20 has an explosion of these red words, quote, like corpses remote, crushed, mutilated, in the vanguard, followed quickly in the rear guard by war, huge, threatening. And the final epic couplet, is this form not itself implicitly red and warlike? With the words burned, illicit, ruined, betrayed. Just in the way the violence in Northern Ireland as experienced by Boland has become ever more inescapable for her, so too the red words, the threatening and destructive words, become more present, more dominant for the reader as the poem progresses. The red words take the field of battle and occupy more and more of the language that the student encounters. Now, poke and prod the students a bit. But still no bridge between these two worlds, you cry. Where's the shouting across the distance we were promised? We introduce the amber words. Now, I'll concede that orange might have been a better hue here, but I daren't accidentally use the words prod and orange in the same paragraph, particularly with this poem. Those amber words are the bridging words, the words that can occupy both worlds, depending on one's maternal or martial perspective. What are those words? I walk the student through the process of identifying those words, though once the students are more open to consciously looking for the double meanings inherent in some of the language that Boland has deliberately chosen, the more likely they are to arrive at least some of the amber words themselves. The tinker, beyond the obviously problematic nomenclature of a time now past, evokes the origin story of the traveller community, the Pave, the Winkeri, who, genetic testing now verifies apparently, diverged from the settled population in the 1600s, during the time of the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland, a time of widespread devastation to which any military historian will attest. But we continue to look for those amber words. A laurel is just a hedge, right? A plant. Well, do you not remember doing ancient Roman history with me in first year? I remember teaching you. I'm a history and politics teacher mainly these days. The laurel of line 10 is a plant, yeah, but it was also a symbol of victory in battle too. It crowned a successful Roman general, acknowledging his triumph. Scrawl the picture of it on the board maybe. If you're lucky, an enterprising student will comment that the laurel is even in the shape of a horseshoe, like the iron shoe we heard described in line 3. Alia iacta est, the die is cast, we have to continue on. What about those curtains that you thought were green words earlier on in the class? What, sir? Well, I also taught you about the defensive features of a castle in first year, didn't I? Curtain walls, sir. Nice. Anyone else? What weapons did those medieval soldiers use? Longbows, sir. But there's none about them here. Well, the verb that describes the firing of an arrow, to loose the arrow, is here. Go find it. Loosed from its daily tether, in line 6. Has the horse being let loose or loosed deliberately from the bow? Once more onto the breach, dear students. Line 25 tells me of Boland's relief. That word suggests strongly that she's glad the horse is left. But is not a relief also a soldier who relieves another man who stands watch as a sentry? Does the uniform of this military man not also often come adorned with the braid of line 29? As an historian, the word that jumps off the page at me, ribboned, in the antepenultimate line, is a reference not just to the pattern of the rose petals, but also to agrarian violence in 19th century Ireland, perpetrated by the ribbon men, thoughtfully placed by Boland at the start of line 29, and therefore capitalised to tantalisingly suggest a proper noun. Here is our shouting across the distance. The green, domestic words, their polar opposite, the red words of war, bridged by the amber words, the words that can be both domestic and destructive, suburban and from sieges, vulnerable and violent. It takes a refined form of words, a poem like this one, to find a place where the seemingly immiscible worlds of suburban Dublin and sectarian Belfast can coexist, where some means of reconciliation can be found from that experience which, for many of our students, must be an historical experience, in a way that it is much more of a lived experience for many of their teachers, at least those of us of a certain age like me. By her word choice, her meticulous choice of language, by the placement of those words, Boland has created something intricate, magical, terrifying, but also something that even the most hardened, cynical student of the modern classroom can easily infiltrate, without even recourse to the bayonet, the lash, the rack, that they often accuse us of using. And if you can, like Boland's warhorse, get their heads down and start snuffling around the words Boland uses to describe her experience, there's little chance, I think, that you'll have them snuff out their enjoyment of the text, but rather open up a new way for them to think about the poem as a poem that bridges gaps.
Thank you for listening to this Members' Voices podcast from iNote, the Irish national organisation for teachers of English. Keep an eye on our website, inote.ie, and on our Twitter handle for updates, professional development opportunities, and more podcasts. You can get in touch with iNote either through Twitter or via our website. Our thanks, as ever, to our valued podcast contributor. Theme music on the podcast is by Dan Leibowitz via the YouTube audio library. See you next time.